In this video, we will embark on a journey spanning over 100 years to see how agricultural machines have changed with each decade. All thanks to the brilliant through the years modification, which unlocks new machines and vehicles in the game every decade. The oldest ones come from the 1930s, but I decided to add a little something from myself to start in the 1920s. I'm a little under 100 years old, but I suspect that such a set, if it were even realistic, might have appeared back in those times. Here we have buffalo and a harvester, which I suspect is powered by turning wheels. If any of you have had the luck of seeing such a machine in a field, feel free to share that in the comments. The horses pulling a trailer are coming to collect the grain. I'm curious how the grain is being pushed through the pipe without a drive shaft when the machine is stationary, but let's overlook that. Since the grain has disappeared from the field, there's still the straw to deal with. And of course, I'll also be using our horse-drawn cart for that. Forestry existed 100 years ago, and axes were probably used quite often back then. I've shown an axe more than once on the channel, but in this video the treat I found is horses that will help us transport logs to the farm. Just tie the log with a rope and off you go. I must admit the physics of this chain are very well done, and even though we only have 2 horses, we managed to drag a huge log, although it takes some time, so we've moved into the 1930s. And here's a prehistoric tractor, but the creator of this mod has combined it with modernity. It's slightly autonomous as there's no driver, or rather the driver is simply invisible. But let's overlook that, because what matters is this prehistoric machine, to which I've attached an equally prehistoric plow, supported by 2 side wheels like a child's bicycle. Ah, what strange times. Let's escape from these years to the 1940s. This category is referred to as older than 1950, and here we can find much older things. There are gems like a very interesting chicken transport pallet from the 19th century, where our chickens look more like stuffed toys in a display than living animals. One aspect worth a gentle mention is potato farming in this category, specifically the potato planter, which is quite pleasant and reminds me of the one my grandfather used to have. The only thing missing is workers actually planting potatoes in the seeds, a small minus for that. As for the potato harvester, it seems like too many potatoes are being thrown back onto the field. In reality, it doesn't quite look like that, but it's just a game, so we can overlook it. And speaking of eyes, what caught mine the most was this sprayer, which looks like someone built it themselves in a garage using an old barrel, a few pipes, a piece of chain, and other parts scattered around the farm. But at least when it comes to the modification, it works flawlessly. It didn't break down once and nothing fell off. The mowers in this category are really interesting, and the grass cutting animations look very realistic. The only downside, or maybe I'm just not too bright, is that I don't know how to connect the 2 mowers. It looks like they can be linked together. I thought about it for a long time until I found myself in the 1950s. Phew, we've pushed through some slightly stretched dates, and from what I've checked, most of the production years we'll now discuss align with what you can read on the internet. One of the most fascinating is this Orkan, probably one of the first choppers not for corn, but for grass and grains. Please ignore the trailer as it's likely from the future, but I couldn't find one in this category that fits the set. The tractor, of course, is here, and according to Google, it was designed in exactly 1953. Speaking of other curiosities, in this decade, we also find this vehicle, though I'm not entirely sure what it has to do with farming. Perhaps just for driving from the farm to the field after lunch, as unfortunately, you can't even load a crate of products onto it. In this decade, I couldn't skip this combine harvester, the Vistula, because my grandfather, or maybe even great-grandfather, had a similar one. As for the modification itself, the model and animations look very nice. There's nothing to complain about. We can work with it at a staggering speed of 6 kilometers per hour, though I suspect it might have been even slower in reality, and harvesting large fields with a single combine could have taken nearly a decade. I mentioned in the 1940s about a potato planter that I saw in real life, or rather one very similar. When it comes to the 1960s, I also saw a potato digger, or a very similar one, in action, and I even had the chance to gather potatoes behind it. I know that the foliage should be removed first, but I didn't find a more interesting mod for that, so you'll have to forgive me. It's also worth mentioning the grain combine that we have available, and honestly, the first thing it reminded me of was one of the combines we get at the start in Farming Simulator 11. Let me know in the comments if you have similar associations. It would be hard to overlook in this category the corn chopper attached to the tractor. I'm not sure if the first one was made in these years, but the model we have handles 2 rows simultaneously. Although in the game, it's 3 rows. Let's overlook that. The mod creator surely did everything they could to make it work properly. I mentioned 2 rows because not so long ago, just 10 years back, I often saw single row machines like this in the fields around my area. And speaking of older times, welcome to the 1970s, in which, in my opinion, 2 legends of agriculture were born: the Bison Combine and the Big Bud tractor. As for the Combine, it's known throughout Poland as a legend, and when it comes to the tractor, I never had the chance to see one anywhere in Europe. And without bragging, I've traveled a bit around Europe in my less than 100-year life. So I call Big Bud a legend because, you have to admit, this tractor really stands out among others. Let's see what's happening in the meadow, and there's quite a lot, as we have a very interesting tether here. I do have one concern though, and maybe someone can correct me in the comments. It seems to me that this kind of machine could later also serve as a rake, but I might be wrong, so if someone knows better, the comments are yours. Speaking of the meadow, it would be hard to pass by the mower, which already looks a bit more modern than the ones I've shown earlier. It's not exactly a marvel of technology, but I have to admit, if I saw this machine in a field today, I wouldn't think it was that old, because its design is quite pleasant. The design in the 1980s was already closer to what we see in the fields today. I don't mean that modern machines are styled after those, but that they were made so well that we can still find them in use today. We can even find similar machines in the game, as both Steyr and John Deere are included in this category. An interesting fact is that John Deere was produced at the end of the 1980s. Among such curiosities, we also find a tractor from International Harvester in this category, and it's not yet a Case as far as I can tell, because from what I've read, Case merged with this company, producing such interesting tractors. The first thing that caught my attention was the long hood, followed by the intriguing way this tractor articulates. One of the interesting things that also caught my attention in this category is the corn harvester. You might be surprised here, as it's a grain harvester. If I had to guess, I would have thought it was for silage, but nothing could be further from the truth. It's for grain. This is a fascinating invention, especially since it only came about in the 1980s, when the development of self-propelled harvesters was in full swing. However, I assume it was aimed at smaller farms. The wild 90s. When it comes to agricultural machines, they were at a pretty decent level. In the game, we find the class Jaguar, though according to Google, the first model appeared as early as the 1970s, but we don't have such an old model in the game. We have to make do with what's available. Interestingly, there's even a row header for the chopper, not the Kemper, which is standard today. Even though it's not a Kemper, the header isn't small either, with 6 rows. Plus, Kemper does appear in the game, though not as massive as today's models. Additionally, there are several class choppers in the game, the Jaguar 695 model, which definitely looks its age. However, the Jaguar 880 model doesn't look much different at first glance from the ones produced today. Moving away from forage harvester, but staying with the class brand, we have the first class Xerion, which debuted on the market in 1997 according to the brand's website. You have to admit, comparing it to the model available in the base version of the game, you can feel the significant technological progress not only in the model itself but also in its features. For fans of John Deere, especially their large tractors, there's something here for you too. I'm talking about the 8960 model, whose long hood resembles the previously presented International Harvester. A large New Holland tractor for special tasks personally reminds me more of the Big Bud than a contemporary New Holland tractor in this power class. As we move through the 90s, it would be hard to overlook the Lizard twin screw, or more precisely the X-Beato birotor, which had the chance to take the world by storm, but I've already talked about it on the channel, so I recommend interested viewers check it out. Speaking of interesting inventions, it's worth mentioning the Fendt Xylon tractor, which I only learned about while preparing this episode. From what I've read, they no longer produce it, and I've never seen one in the field, even though it was manufactured in 1996. It's not such an old tractor, but we can assume it wasn't a sales hit. And here we are, welcome to modern times. Because 20-something years for a tractor is practically nothing. Most of the machines and vehicles in this category won't surprise anyone, but I'll still try to surprise you. Starting with the John Deere 825 row crop cultivator. I must admit, this surprised me because I usually associate John Deere with larger machines. While it still has over a 4.5 meter working width, it's no giant. In my opinion, it stands out in this category, although we do have quite a bit of John Deere equipment in the game that doesn't differ much from modern machines. Most of the machines in this category are vehicles from the base version of the game that everyone knows well, so I won't bore you with them. However, what caught my attention this time is once again the class brand, but this time in yellow. I'm not sure why, as I've already discussed the green paint associated with this brand in previous years. To my surprise, yellow. I read a bit about it, and I couldn't find anything that aligns with the dates mentioned, as it was said that production of the yellow and black class was supposed to end in the 1990s. If anyone has more knowledge on this topic, the comments are yours. In addition to that class, I also noticed a sprayer, or rather its brand, because I've never heard of it, and I don't think I've ever had the chance to see one in the field or even pass one on the road. And here we are in modern times. You could say hello and goodbye, but there are a few gems here that not everyone may have heard of. We do have a giant like the Case Steiger 715, which makes quite an impression. You can feel the power and modern design both on wheels and tracks. It's a real beast. I was also impressed by the sprayer because I didn't know that Case produces sprayers, let alone that it has sugarcane in its name. I'm not sure, maybe it's some specific equipment. Feel free to share your knowledge in the comments. For now, I'll say goodbye and see you soon.